Welcome to Say the Question. I'm Joe, this is Sam, and today we're asking the Fermi Paradox question that sits behind the whole thing. If intelligent life should be out there, why does space feel so quiet?
Because that quiet is weirdly loaded. The standard framing is a contradiction between how likely extraterrestrial intelligence seems and the fact that we have no evidence for it. No clear signs, no visitors, nothing obvious.
Right, so it's not a verdict, it's a starting point. Let's begin with the basic setup, because the starting take here is that the silence itself is doing the unsettling work. Sam, start us off.
The weird part about the Fermi Paradox isn't just that space is big, it's that the silence starts feeling personal, like the universe heard the question and decided not to answer.
That's the hook, yeah. The basic idea is simple enough. If the universe is that large and life can happen at least once, people start expecting a lot more noise than this. So, the first useful move is to separate the weird feeling from what it actually proves.
Right, and that's why it doesn't stay a nerdy astronomy question. It starts sounding like a bad sign. Not proof of anything dramatic, just the kind of silence that makes your brain go, okay, so what's the catch?
So you're saying the shock is less about planets and more about meaning?
Exactly. I mean, the astronomy part matters, but the thing that actually lands is the implication. If the universe is this huge and still feels empty, people don't hear a neutral fact. They hear a question mark pointed at us.
And that is where the danger starts, because a question mark is not a conclusion. It can mean life is rare, life is common but hard to notice. Civilizations don't last long, or we're missing the right way to look. Those are very different claims, and the silence alone doesn't choose one.
Sure, but the silence still feels like the universe is terrible at customer service. No callback, no confirmation email, no, we received your cosmic inquiry.
The universe is not great at follow-up, no. But that's exactly why people overread it. A blank screen invites stories. We don't just notice the absence, we start filling it with theories about what the absence means.
And the theories get weird fast, because the underlying fear is pretty human. Maybe life is not the default. Maybe we're not looking at a crowded universe that forgot to wave. Maybe we're looking at something that is a lot lonelier than we'd like.
That part is real, but I want to be careful with it. Feels lonelier is not the same as is lonelier. The emotional punch comes from uncertainty, not from a hidden verdict buried in the stars.
So the honest version is not where the aliens gotcha. It's more like, why does it matter so much that we can't hear anyone? That feels like a different question. A less macho one, maybe, but a more honest one.
Yeah, and once you ask it that way, the whole thing gets sharper. Because now, the issue is not just whether life exists out there. It's whether silence means life is fragile, isolated, hard to detect, or just rarer than our instincts want to admit.
And that is what makes it feel personal. Not because the universe is actually thinking about us, obviously, but because the silence pokes at the story humans like to tell themselves about being important, central, or at least not weirdly alone.
Right, and that's the real tension we have to keep intact. The silence is a scientific puzzle, but it also lands as a challenge to what humans think their place in the universe might mean.
And once you hear it that way, it's hard to go back to treating it like a trivia question.
Exactly. The empty sky is doing two jobs at once. It is asking what we can prove, and it is quietly messing with the old assumption that humanity gets a special spot just for being here.
Okay, let's pin down the boring part first, because if we don't, everybody starts arguing with a cartoon version of the question. And the cartoon version is usually just aliens, yes or no, which is not really the point.
The basic Fermi paradox is the tension between expectation and observation. Roughly, if intelligent life could be common, why don't we see evidence of it? That is the whole engine of the thing before anybody piles on theories.
Joe, am I flattening it too much already, or is that actually the useful way to say it? Because I can already hear the internet yelling that I've insulted a subfield.
It's the useful way to say it. People attach the phrase, "Where is everybody?" to a 1950 Los Alamos lunch conversation with Fermi. But the cleaner scientific version is,
if intelligent life is common, why don't we see any evidence of it?
exactly. And that evidence part matters because the paradox is about what we can observe. It's not a proof that no one is out there. It's a problem about the gap between what we'd expect and what we've actually seen.
So the paradox itself is the empty room, and the explanations are everything people throw at the empty room after the fact. That's the piece people mix up. And then they start talking as if one answer is the whole problem. That is how a weird question turns into a bad argument.
That's the clean version. The usual mistake is treating one explanation like it is the question itself. They're rare is an answer. They're hiding is an answer. We're not looking in the right way is an answer. The paradox is why the question exists at all, not which answer sounds coolest on a forum.
And that distinction matters because once you blur it, you start acting like a hypothesis already proves something. You haven't. You've just chosen your favorite story about the silence. There's a big difference between this might be true and this is what the silence means.
Right, and the common scientific framing is basically, if intelligent life should be common, why don't we observe signs of it? That's the question, not what is the final answer, not which theory wins, just the observation problem that refuses to go away.
So the phrase, "where is everybody?" is useful, but it's also a little trap because it sounds casual in a way the real question isn't. It makes it feel like a missing persons case in space when the actual issue is whether our expectations match the evidence we can actually get.
That's fair. It is shorthand, not the whole argument. The shorthand works because people immediately get the vibe. If the room should be loud and it isn't, you want to know whether the room is empty, whether the sound is blocked, or whether you are standing in the wrong hallway. But the shorthand can also make the question sound simpler than it is.
A silent bar in a city that should be loud. That analogy actually helps because the weird part isn't that the bar is quiet, it's that it's quiet when you expected noise. You're not staring at the silence because silence is mystical. You're staring at it because it broke the pattern.
And once the pattern breaks, people rush to fill the gap. That is where the explanation factories start running. But the honest version is still pretty plain. We have limited observation, a huge universe, and a question about whether the absence of obvious signs means anything. It might mean a lot. It might mean very little. We just shouldn't pretend the silence has already confessed.
That's the part I want listeners to keep in their pocket. The paradox is not, aliens definitely exist and vanished. It's closer to, if they were common enough, where are the signs? And that gap can be exciting, creepy, or both, which is probably why people keep reaching for a bigger meaning than the definition alone gives them.
Yeah, and now we can ask the more interesting follow-up. Why does that gap bother people so much? Because once you clean up the definition, the silence stops being a trivia answer and starts feeling like a challenge. That is where the suspicious part of the conversation actually begins.
Okay, now that we've got the definition out of the way, the uncomfortable part is why this question doesn't just sound scientific. It hits a nerve. When people say, "Where is everybody?" they usually aren't only asking about aliens. They're asking whether silence means we're missing something huge.
That's the right place to start. The evidence is thin, but the feeling isn't fake. Humans are very good at treating absence like it has a message, especially when they expected some kind of signal and got nothing.
So the instinct is basically, if nothing answered, something must be off. Which is not crazy, honestly. If you wait for a reply long enough, your brain starts building explanations whether you want it to or not. It doesn't like sitting there with nothing to hold on to.
Exactly. And with space, the stakes get absurdly large. It's not just nobody answered my text. It's we looked at the sky, we looked for company, and it stayed quiet. That makes people want to assign meaning to the quiet before they know what it actually means.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say the worry isn't just about evidence? It feels like people hear the silence and immediately start deciding what kind of universe they live in.
No, that's fair. The question quickly becomes philosophical because the answer seems to point back at us. If life is common, hidden, short-lived, or hard to detect, that's one kind of world. If life is rare, that's a much harsher one. Either way, people hear more than data in it.
And that's where the trouble starts. Because now the conversation isn't just, we haven't found them yet. It's, what does it say about us if we never do? That's a much more personal question. And people project all kinds of stuff onto it. Hope, dread, superiority, loneliness, all of it.
Right. Some people hear possibility and get excited. Some hear emptiness and get spooked. Some hear a warning and start acting like silence itself is proof of doom. None of those reactions are random. They're what happens when a missing answer gets turned into a story.
Which is why the topic keeps pulling people out of the science lane and into the emotional one. Nobody likes unresolved silence. Not in a relationship, not in work, not in politics, and definitely not when the subject is the entire universe. The mind hates a gap and tries to fill it.
And that's the part worth respecting without getting dramatic about it. The silence is real. The discomfort is real. But the leap from we don't know to we've discovered a terrifying truth is where people start overfitting their feelings onto the evidence.
So the honest version is that the absence can feel suspicious without actually proving anything. It's a clue that our expectations might be too simple or too human. We're built to notice response, pattern, presence. And when that isn't there, we naturally assume the blank space matters.
Yeah, and the blank space matters emotionally, even when it doesn't yet mean what people want it to mean. That's why this question keeps drifting from astronomy into meaning. And that's also why easy answers are so tempting. They make the silence feel less like a problem, even if they don't actually solve it.
Okay, but once people get uneasy, they reach for the cheapest answer in the room. And with this question, the cheap answers are usually garbage.
And they come in two flavors, the flat dismissal and the ego trip.
One is aliens don't exist, and the other is aliens definitely do exist, and we're the universe's special little...
Nope, stop there. That's not insight, that's ego in a lab coat.
Fair. Kill that version first, because we're special is doing a ridiculous amount of unpaid labor in this conversation.
It is. But the first one needs to go too, for a different reason. We haven't found them yet is not the same as they're impossible.
People mash those together because uncertainty feels rude. If there isn't a clean answer, they act like the question itself must be broken.
That is basically the move. Absence of detection is not proof of absence, especially when the search is still tiny compared with what you're actually searching.
So the silence by itself is not a final statement. It might mean life is rare or far away or hard to notice, or that intelligent life doesn't stay loud for long.
Exactly. Those are all different claims, and the annoying part is people keep collapsing them into one dramatic sentence.
And once they do that, the question stops being about evidence and starts being about identity. If you don't buy their answer, suddenly you're naive or paranoid.
Yeah, like the question is secretly a test of whether you're optimistic enough, spiritual enough, or suspicious enough. It's a weird amount of personality to cram into one patch of empty sky.
That's what bugs me. A hard unknown shows up, and people turn it into a referendum on how special humanity is supposed to feel.
Right, and that is the cheap move. It takes one missing piece and turns it into a full philosophy. Either we're insignificant or we're the point.
Is that really the better way to say it? Because the we're the point version sounds less like science and more like somebody trying to win an argument with their own reflection.
That's the useful distinction. It isn't just wrong because it's arrogant. It's wrong because it treats a gap in evidence like a compliment addressed to us.
And the other lazy answer is just as bad in the opposite direction. It hears, "We haven't found them," and immediately upgrades that into, "There's nobody out there."
Which is why both answers are so useful to people who don't want to sit with uncertainty. One lets you feel superior. The other lets you feel finished.
And then everyone gets a little smug about it. The funny part is that the mystery itself doesn't care whether you solved it with humility or arrogance.
No, it just sits there. The silence can be a clue without being a verdict, and that's the distinction people keep skipping.
So the honest version is both of those first answers are too neat. They flatten a hard question into a story that flatters the person saying it.
That's the clean version. The next step is not picking the most comforting story. It's asking which explanations still hold up when you stop rewarding them for sounding decisive.
Okay, so the lazy answers are gone. The real split is pretty simple. Either life is hard to get going and harder to keep going, or it's out there and we're just terrible at noticing it.
That's the useful fork. One side says the universe may be full of dead ends. Chemistry is rare. Stable planets are rarer. Complex life is fragile. And technological civilizations may not last long enough to matter. The other side says none of that has to be true for the sky to stay quiet. Distance, timing, and our own detection limits can make a busy universe look empty.
And the first one does not sound crazy to me. It's not even especially dramatic. If getting from simple life to complicated, tool-using, self-aware life is a nasty little gauntlet, then maybe the universe is mostly full of almosts.
That's the strongest version of the rarity argument, and it's better than the cartoon version where everything just dies in a cloud of smoke. The basic idea is that each step could be hard, and a lot of hard steps in a row makes the whole thing uncommon. Not impossible, just uncommon enough that we shouldn't act shocked by silence.
Right, and there's a grim elegance to that. You don't need a villain. You just need a bunch of bottlenecks that most things don't get through.
Exactly. And one serious version of that argument is longevity. A civilization does not have to be doomed by a movie-worthy disaster. It can just fail to last long enough, or decide expansion is not worth the trouble, or hit a ceiling where going outward is too hard to bother with.
That part I buy, honestly. People hear rare and think, magic asteroid, everything explodes. But a quieter version is more believable. Maybe intelligence is real, but durable, outward moving intelligence is the weird part. Maybe having a mind is one thing. Building a civilization that survives itself and keeps reaching is the harder thing.
And that is still a pretty serious claim without turning into melodrama. It just says the filter, if there is one, may be made of ordinary limits, not one dramatic catastrophe. Slow erosion, bad incentives, self-limitation. Whatever the mix is, none of that needs a conspiracy vibe attached to it.
Okay, but if that's true, do you think the real distinction is between life and intelligent life, or between intelligent life and detectable life? Because those are not the same complaint.
That's the sharper version of it. Life might be common in the boring sense, microbial stuff, chemistry doing chemistry, while the kind of civilization that leaves a clear signature is much rarer. Or, even if it exists, it may not broadcast in a way we recognize. So you can have a universe with plenty of life and still have almost no obvious neighbors.
And the other reasonable read is almost the opposite. Life could be common, even intelligent life could be common, but the universe is huge and old. If civilizations are spread far apart in space and time, they can miss each other completely. That is not a failure of existence. It is a failure of overlap.
That's the part people skip. They hear silence and assume emptiness, but the silence might just mean the windows don't line up. A civilization can exist, burn bright for a while, and still be too early or too late for anyone else to notice it. On that reading, the universe is not empty. It's just badly synchronized.
So basically, there may be plenty of neighbors, but they're on different schedules. That is a depressing kind of ordinary. No grand reveal, just bad timing and a lot of space.
Yeah, and timing is doing a lot of work there. A civilization might only be easy to spot for a relatively short stretch compared with how long the universe has been around. If that's true, then where is everybody is partly a question about whether two interesting things can overlap long enough to see each other at all.
And that's why the hidden life version is both humbling and annoying. It means the answer might not be nobody's home. It might be you checked the wrong house in the dark.
That's fair, with one caveat. It's humbling, but it's not a free pass to say anything could be out there. The silent sky argument still has to respect what we actually know about energy, travel, signals, and scale. The point is just that absence of evidence is not the same thing as evidence of absence when the search is tiny compared with the thing you're searching for.
So the honest answer is not life is rare or life is everywhere. It's that both readings are plausible, and each one has a different emotional punch. One says we may be luckier than we think. The other says we may be surrounded by things we'll never meet.
And that split is exactly why the silence gets under people's skin. The next question is, what evidence can actually move us between those two readings? Because vibes are cheap, and the universe is not giving us a free hint.
Okay, so this is where we stop doing the cosmic shrug and look at the actual receipts. Because space is quiet sounds final until you remember how tiny our search has been compared with the whole question.
That's the right move. The paradox feels like a conclusion, but the evidence problem is simpler and more annoying. What have we looked for, with what tools, and across how much of the possible signal space?
And the answer is probably not enough, which is rude but also extremely on brand for science.
Pretty much. SETI searches are limited by sensitivity, frequency coverage, the kinds of signals the equipment can detect, and how much sky has actually been observed. So a null result is real, but it's not the same thing as saying the universe is empty.
So the headline is not, "We searched the galaxy and got nothing." It's more like, "We checked some narrow slices and didn't catch anything that fit the rules."
Yes, and those rules matter a lot. If a signal is weak, on the wrong frequency, packaged in a way our gear doesn't notice, or coming from a patch of sky we didn't cover, the silence doesn't tell you much more than not here, not in this way, not yet.
Okay, but Joe, am I overstating it if I say people keep hearing "no detected signal" and quietly upgrading it to "there's nobody out there"? Because that's cleaner and less unsettling.
No, that's fair. The brain loves a neat ending, and the Fermi Paradox practically invites one. But scientifically, absence of evidence is only as strong as the search behind it. And right now, the search is still partial. There's a classic analogy for this. If you look out one window and don't see bears, you don't get to announce the whole forest is bear-free.
Which is a very bold conclusion to draw from one window.
Exactly. The analogy doesn't prove aliens, obviously. It just shows the logic problem with treating an incomplete look as if it were an all clear. NASA's SETI material treats the search as a bunch of variables, too. Signal frequency, polarization, coordinates, duration. That's a lot more complicated than point telescope, wait for beep.
So the search isn't just a single glance into the dark. It's a pile of very specific guesses about where a usable signal would even live.
Right. And that's why the silence is scientifically tricky. If you haven't checked the right bands, the right times, or the right parts of the sky, you can miss something real without knowing you missed it. The absence may be genuine in the slice you checked, but that slice can still be a tiny slice.
That's the useful distinction. Because we haven't found a signal and there is no signal anywhere are not the same sentence, even if people keep trying to make them act like twins.
And NASA's plain language framing is basically that the search for life beyond Earth is still early. So the Fermi Paradox names the eerie silence, but it doesn't settle whether life is rare, far away, hidden, or just hard to detect.
Which means the paradox is doing two jobs at once. It's a scientific puzzle about detection, and it's also a little existential slap in the face. The same empty sky can mean we don't know yet, or we might be very alone. And those are not the same feeling.
That's why people talk past each other. One side hears silence and treats it like a verdict. The other hears we're still searching and treats it like a dodge. The honest answer is less satisfying than either. The data are real, but the conclusion is still underpowered.
And that underpowered part matters, because if your search tools are narrow, you can turn not found into a personality trait for the universe. Humans do that all the time. We call it certainty, when it is really just a confident lack of imagination.
That's the cleaner version. The useful question isn't, have we proven we're alone? Because we haven't. It's, how much confidence does the current silence deserve, given how little of the search space we've sampled? That keeps the argument honest, without pretending the mystery is fake.
So the receipts don't kill the weird feeling. They just keep us from pretending the weird feeling is evidence. Which is annoying because the universe refuses to be convenient.
Exactly. And that sets up the next question. If the silence isn't proof by itself, what else would make it meaningful? That's where the incentives, the search strategy, and the human appetite for a dramatic answer all start mattering.
Okay, once the science is a little clearer, the next ugly layer is this. Why do certain answers keep winning anyway? Not because they're always strongest, but because they're emotionally useful.
That's the right move. The Fermi Paradox isn't just a data problem. It's a story problem too. People are trying to make sense of cosmic silence, and the stories that spread fastest are usually the ones that give them something clear to hold on to.
And the clear thing can be really flattering. Either we're rare and special, or we're doomed. Or somebody out there is hiding, or the universe is basically a cosmic insult. People love a version with a face on it.
Sure, ambiguity is annoying. If the answer is, we don't know yet, that's honest. But it doesn't give anyone a satisfying shape to carry around. A neat explanation gives you certainty, and certainty is a very marketable product when the alternative is just open space and a shrug.
Because the boring answer asks you to sit with not knowing. It doesn't hand you a villain or a destiny or even a tidy lesson. It just says, the universe is bigger than your need for closure, which is deeply rude.
That's exactly why the dramatic versions travel so well. They convert a blank space into something legible. The public conversation loves that because a legible story can be repeated in 10 seconds, while the careful answer sounds like, please remain emotionally available to uncertainty.
Mystery is weirdly easier to sell when it feels like a threat or a revelation. We're alone lands as existential dread. We're being watched lands as a thriller. We're too primitive to notice them lands as humiliation. Those all travel better than the evidence is still thin.
And that's not automatically manipulation. A lot of it is just human psychology doing what it does. We dislike unresolved uncertainty, so we drift toward explanations that lower the discomfort, even if the evidence base is still lopsided.
So the incentive isn't always lie louder. Sometimes it's just say something that makes the room less weird. That's a much more ordinary kind of distortion, which is honestly more annoying because it doesn't require villains.
Right, and the room likes that because people are carrying different anxieties into the same question. Some want significance. Some want reassurance. Some want the cleanest possible explanation. Some just want to feel clever for being the person who saw through the obvious answer.
And the answer you pick can become part of your identity really fast. If you say we're alone, you can sound sober. If you say the universe is packed, you can sound hopeful. If you say we're being hidden from, you can sound like you're noticing what everyone else missed.
Exactly. That's why status matters here. Not in the cartoon version where everybody is secretly performing, but in the normal version where beliefs signal what kind of person you are. Being cautious can look smart. Being dramatic can look visionary. And being skeptical of the whole thing can look independent.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say the whole topic becomes a status game? Like, people aren't just asking what's true, they're also asking what kind of person they get to be if they believe a certain version.
No, that's fair, as long as we don't turn everyone into a poser. There's status in being the cosmic realist, status in being the big visionary, and status in being the person who says, actually, the evidence doesn't support that. Those are all social positions, not just intellectual ones.
That's the part people skip. The universe gets turned into a personality test. If you're scared, you may prefer a story that explains the fear. If you're lonely, you may prefer a story that says we're significant. If you like certainty, you may prefer any answer that sounds finished.
And if you want the cleanest version of it, the basic idea is that people do not choose interpretations by evidence alone. They choose them through fear, hope, status, and the kind of cosmic narrative that feels livable.
Right, but that also means we should be suspicious of anything that arrives too perfectly packaged. Not because it's fake by default, but because a story that feels immediately complete is often doing more emotional work than evidential work. And that's where we probably need a break before we wander into unsupported territory. Okay, here's the break we need to hit. We haven't found life is not the same as someone is hiding life. That sounds obvious, but this topic keeps pulling people toward the second sentence. Because mystery is itchy, and the brain hates leaving a blank spot blank.
And that's where the conversation can go off the rails fast. The honest position can be boring. Maybe life is rare. Maybe it's hard to detect. Maybe our searches are still too crude. But boring isn't the same as empty. It just means you don't get to fill in the gaps with whatever story feels coolest.
The dangerous part is the mental shortcut. People hear a quiet sky and start upgrading it into a plot, like the silence itself must be
a confession. And that's the jump we can't make. Silence can mean a lot of things, including we're not looking in the right way, or we're looking at a tiny slice of a huge problem.
Right. So the fair question is not who is lying. It's what do we actually know? What are we guessing at? And which part are we dressing up as certainty because the mystery feels too big to leave alone? Joe, am I overstating how fast that turns into nonsense?
No, that's the useful pressure point. We don't know yet is not a cop-out if it's the most accurate thing on the table. The cop-out is pretending a guess is stronger just because it sounds dramatic or because it gives the silence a villain.
And that's the part people keep blurring. Absence of evidence can mean weak tools, bad timing, tiny samples, or just looking at the wrong slice of the problem. That is not a magic shield that proves the thing you're missing is real. It just means the search result is not the same thing as the whole universe.
Exactly. And if you want to make the leap to concealment, you need a different standard. You'd have to show why hidden intent is the better explanation, not just the more dramatic one. Otherwise, you're not uncovering a pattern. You're handing the mystery a costume and calling it evidence.
That's the trap, though. People love the secret answer because it feels more satisfying than we haven't checked enough yet. The first one sounds like a story with a villain. The second one sounds like homework. And somehow, the universe keeps choosing homework.
Well, yeah, but we don't know yet only feels weak if you think the universe owes us a clean answer on our schedule. It doesn't. The responsible move is to stay curious without turning every blank into intent. So what would count as a fair concern for you instead of just a leap?
A fair concern is something like our tools might miss a lot, our search window might be narrow, or the thing we want might be harder to spot than we assumed. That's a real question. But once you say, therefore someone must be hiding it, you've left the evidence behind and started renting confidence from the vibe.
That's the boundary worth protecting. Curiosity asks whether the silence is telling us something we haven't noticed yet. Accusation asks who did it, before you've earned the right to ask who. Those are not the same move, even if they feel adjacent when the topic is spooky.
And we don't know yet is not a cop-out when the question is genuinely open. It's just the honest status report. You can still say the silence is unsettling. It absolutely is, without pretending unsettling automatically means concealed. Otherwise, every unanswered question becomes a cartoon villain, and that's lazy even by human standards.
Yeah, and that clean line matters because the next mistake is treating every explanation like it deserves the same confidence. Once you stop calling mystery a cover-up, You can compare the real possibilities without giving the loudest theory a free pass. That's the part people usually skip.
Okay, so the cleanup job here is mostly rescuing the phrase from people who use it like a final answer. The Fermi Paradox is not a verdict. It's what you get when you look at the sky and realize the question got louder than the evidence.
That's the cleanest version. Britannica's definition is basically that. It's a contradiction or question about missing evidence, not a conclusion about whether intelligent life exists.
Which is already more honest than the sloppy version people toss around. They hear Fermi Paradox and act like the universe filed a report and we can just read the conclusion at the bottom.
And that's the mistake. A hard question can feel persuasive because it's compact. But compact is not the same as solved. SETI makes the same basic point in a different way. You do not get to make huge claims off a tiny search.
So the dumb take is, space is quiet, therefore, case closed. But quiet can mean a lot of things. Rare, far away, hard to detect, hidden, maybe even doomed. None of those are proof, but none of them are nothing either.
Right. And that is why the phrase gets abused. Silence is data. It just isn't a full sentence yet. It tells you something about the search, not everything about the universe, and definitely not enough to skip the rest of the thinking.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say people keep mistaking the question for the answer because the question is emotionally satisfying? It sounds like we're doing something profound even when we're mostly just staring at a blank page.
No, I think that's exactly the pressure point. The paradox feels like a conclusion because it has a name and a shape. But the name just packages the uncertainty. It doesn't resolve it. It lets us talk about the problem without pretending we've already solved the problem.
That's the part I think people skip. They want the paradox to do the work for them. Look, it's paradoxical. Therefore, my preferred story wins. That is not reasoning. That's using the label as a shortcut and hoping nobody notices the gap underneath it.
And it happens on both sides. The pessimists overread the silence. The optimists overread the absence of evidence. And both act like they're being very serious while skipping the hard part. The harder part is admitting that the same gap can support several different explanations.
Which is why I like the stricter version of the question. Not, are we alone? Like that's already wrapped up in a neat box. More like, given how little we've actually found, what can we responsibly say about how common life is, and what are we just guessing at?
That's better. It keeps the door open without pretending the door is wide open. And it matches the basic logic here. The paradox starts inquiry. It doesn't finish it. Every answer you try to put under it still has to survive the fact that the search is thin and the evidence is still incomplete.
So even the cleaner scientific version is annoying in the right way. You don't get to declare the universe empty, and you don't get to declare it crowded. You get a real question, a limited search, and a lot of room for people to fake certainty if they're not careful.
Exactly. And NASA's basic framing around searching for life fits that too. Every answer just opens more questions. That's why the paradox matters without settling anything. It forces the uncomfortable part, which is that we are still trying to figure out what kind of universe this even is.
Right, and that's the useful correction. The Fermi Paradox isn't the conclusion sitting there in space like it already knows the ending. It's the place where the polite version of the story starts wobbling and the real question begins. Okay, so the polite answer is easy to say out loud. The universe is huge, life is complicated, and we probably shouldn't act like the silence means we've been handed some grand verdict about humanity. That's the respectable version. The annoying part is that it feels safe in exactly the way a half answer feels safe. It sounds thoughtful without forcing anyone to sit with what it actually leaves unresolved.
It is safe, and that's why people like it. It lets you sound measured without touching the part that matters, which is whether we're
common, rare, early, late, or just missing the point.
yeah, all of that. And the polite answer works socially because it sounds humble. It says, let's not overclaim, which is fair. But sometimes humility gets used as a way to avoid taking the question seriously enough for it to change your view of anything.
So the safe version is, we don't know yet. And the real version is, we don't know yet, and that uncertainty is kind of humiliating. Because if we were hoping for the universe to reassure us, it is doing a terrible job. It does not seem interested in making humanity feel special, or even making us feel centered enough to relax.
That's the sharper version. The paradox is not only about stars and planets and whether the detection problem is hard. It's also about human vanity. People want the cosmos to either flatter them or explain them, and instead it mostly refuses both jobs. That refusal is part of why the question sticks around.
And that refusal is why it starts to feel like a mirror, right? Not because the universe is secretly about us, but because the silence forces us to look at what we're bringing to the question. Are we assuming life should be everywhere because we want company, or assuming it must be rare because we want to matter more?
Exactly. The silence doesn't hand you a clean fact and walk away. It reflects back the assumptions we smuggle in. A mirror doesn't tell you what to think. It just shows you what you're already standing in front of. If you hear emptiness and immediately decide that means loneliness or significance or doom, you're already interpreting the evidence through a human story.
Okay, but is that story always a problem? Because part of me thinks the whole point is that humans are story-making machines. We can't help turning silence into a meaning question. So is the honest move just to admit that instead of pretending we're some cold little calculator floating in space?
That's fair, and I wouldn't erase that part. The honest move is not to pretend we're emotionless. It's to separate "this matters to us" from "this proves something about the universe." Those are different claims. The feeling is real. The conclusion may still be too big.
So you're saying uncertainty isn't the same thing as mystery with extra music playing over it. It's just uncertainty, plus our need to make it mean something. That's the uncomfortable gap. Because the polite answer wants to smooth it into a neat little shrug.
Right, and that gap is where people overreach. Some act like the silence is basically proof of emptiness. Others act like the silence is secretly a message, or a test, or a hint that we're early and therefore important. Both are ways of refusing to sit with not knowing. The stronger answer is smaller and less flattering.
That's the annoying part. The polite answer lets everyone sound mature, but the real answer is that the universe does not hand us a nice label. Not common, not chosen, not doomed, not even especially understood, just not answered.
And that is the piece worth keeping. The silence is not proof of a cosmic insult, but it is also not nothing. It changes the emotional shape of the question because it stops being about where is everybody and starts being about what it does to us when the biggest place we know gives us no reply.
Which is basically the final awkward step here. If the answer never comes, do we treat that as just missing information, or do we admit the silence is doing something to our idea of being human? Because that is where the polite answer runs out of road. Okay, so here's the part that actually matters at the end. It's not just, is anybody out there? It's, what happens to human beings when the answer keeps not arriving? At some point, the silence stops being background and starts feeling like a comment.
That's the cleaner question. The science puzzle is about life elsewhere, sure, but the emotional pressure comes from being stuck in a universe that never seems to confirm what we are, or whether we're unusual, or just early, or just hard to detect.
And people do this thing where they act like they only want evidence, but that's not quite true. They want the cosmos to be legible. They want to know whether life is common, whether consciousness is a freak accident, or whether the whole show is still in the opening act.
Right, and those are very different reactions hiding under the same headline. If life is rare, that can make us feel special in a weirdly lonely way. If life is common, but hidden, the silence is mostly about distance and timing. And if life keeps dying before it spreads, then the silence starts to feel like a warning, which is a lot for one question to carry.
So the deeper fear isn't really we're alone in the cartoon version. It's more like we might never get a clean outside confirmation that we matter. And we still have to build a life without that little gold star from the universe. Joe, is that just ego, or is that a real human need?
No, I think it's real. I wouldn't call it ego in the shallow sense. Humans are self-aware enough that we don't just live inside events. We also watch ourselves living them. And that makes outside confirmation weirdly powerful. If nobody ever answers back, people start wondering whether they made the whole thing up, even when they didn't.
That's the ugly part. The silence is not just no signal. It's also the space where we project meaning, fear, loneliness, superiority, all of it. So the same empty sky can make somebody feel humbled, and somebody else feel abandoned, and somebody else feel weirdly important.
And that helps explain why the Fermi Paradox keeps sticking around. It doesn't just ask whether there is life elsewhere. It asks what kind of story humans tell when the universe refuses to hand them a caption. The answer might be, life is rare, or life is hidden, or we haven't looked long enough. But emotionally, the question keeps landing on the same sore spot.
Which is that we don't actually like ambiguity when it gets personal. People can tolerate mystery in a lab. They get a lot less relaxed when the mystery is whether their whole existence is a one-off with no witness.
Exactly. That's why the question feels larger than astronomy. The silence may be about physics, distance, evolution, and timing, but it also functions like a mirror with nothing in it. And the honest part is that most of us don't just want to know what is out there. We want to know whether being here means something from the outside, not only from inside our own heads.
And maybe the hard correction is that those are not the same thing. Something can matter even if it isn't observed. And something can be real even if it isn't confirmed by a second voice. That's not as comforting as we want, but it's sturdier than pretending the universe is obligated to reassure us.
That's the line I'd keep. Silence is not rejection, and it's not proof of insignificance. It's just silence. The universe may never give us the kind of answer people are hoping for, but that doesn't make the question childish. It just means the question points to a need we actually have.
So maybe the ending is less, are we alone, and more, what do we do with the fact that we need not to be?
We treat that need as human, not embarrassing. Keep the search open, keep the evidence honest, and don't confuse no answer yet with no answer ever.
Yeah, the universe may stay quiet, but the quiet still tells us something real. We want to matter. And wanting that isn't stupid.
So, that's the end of this one. We appreciate you listening to Say the Question. Follow Say the Question, and we'll be back with another episode tomorrow.